Hey everyone, welcome to another portrait sketch walkthrough. Today we're going to be drawing a photo of Aidana, and thank you so much Aidana for letting me draw you. I'm so honored to be able to draw you again. If you guys recognize her, she was my first oil painting. So yeah, we're going to be drawing her in real time this time. If you end up liking this one, make sure to check out my Patreon. I do these real-time walkthroughs every month. The paper that I'm using is my Etcher Lab watercolor sketchbook, and the pencil that I'm using is my Blackwing matte pencil. I will also have the reference photo right next to the drawing so you guys see what I'm talking about. And we're just gonna start. So the first thing that I do is try to place her in the page. This isn't as important, but I just want to see what the drawing would look like inside the paper. But after that, we're just gonna start with a circle like most all portrait drawings do. This is the whole head. This isn't just the face, so we're gonna make room for her skull in this one. On the right side it's a little bit flatter because she isn't looking at us straight on, and then we're gonna have this straight line that's going down, and it's gonna tell us exactly where to center her face. Then we're gonna have another line that's cutting across that circle, and it's gonna tell us where to place the eyeballs. The length of the face is different for every person, but usually I would have the length about the same size as half of the circle, and that's gonna be how long her face is. And then after that, we're just gonna start reconnecting the circle to that line in sort of this V shape. This doesn't have to be accurate this early on. We just need to have some kind of structure to the face that we can add to. And once we have that, we can then start to place her neck and shoulders. These things are very pose specific, so what I'm doing is just paying attention to the reference photo and how they're laid out there. And then so I can figure out the layout for the composition for the portrait, I'm gonna also early on start to make out the shape of the hair, because I really like how she has her hair and I want it to fill out the page maybe a little bit more than the reference photo. So after that's done, I'm gonna just add another line over her eyeline so I have somewhere to place her eyebrows on before I start with drawing her eyeballs. The eyes are always the hardest to draw, and so it makes it easier for me to place them on the structure of the head first to try and see if the layout looks good before I could go over the details. And then once I have had that, I'm just gonna start with this very big shape for the nose. I think the nose is very important in a portrait, and I just want to see how much it fills the face. And then when I'm placing the lips, what I'm doing is making space for her chin first before I start to place the corners of her mouth. And as you can see, I am using the position of the eyeballs to see how stretched out her lips are. And so once I have those, I can then finish out the lip line and start to place the overall shapes of her lips. And then we can go on to placing her eyebrows, and since we have that line, it's a lot easier now. And then when I'm starting to fill in the details for her face, I'm actually starting with where, I guess it's called the apple of the cheeks are, since I want to make room for them before I can really start to shape her jawline. As you see, it's a little bit more squared out than how I initially had it. And when you're doing this, try to make sure that you're really paying attention to the reference photo, because it's something that's very different for different people. And then once that is closer to the reference photo, I can then adjust her neck and her shoulders to be more proportional to her face. So once that's done, and especially when I have had her eyebrows done, I can see now that her hairline is supposed to go farther up in her forehead, so I'm readjusting how I initially had it. And the same way for the overall shape of her hair. In my initial layout, I had them lower than they should be, and so I'm changing that right now. And the rest of her hair too, I just wanted to fill out the page more. Not every element in a photo you have to get 100% correct. Sometimes there are things you can adjust to, and that is one of the things that I did. So now it's time for us to fill in the details of her features, and we're starting with the hardest one, which are her eyes. And I'm starting them by placing where their corners are, and I'm doing one corner and then the other so that they fall in line with each other. But I actually think that with this initial layout, I made her eyes look too close together. As you can see, that's not how it looks in the reference photo, so I do adjust that later on. With the eyeballs, really made things a lot easier, because now we can just imagine how the skin will drape across the spheres that the eyeballs are. And we don't need to worry too much about if we're making them too big or too little, because we've already established their place on her face. I'm now placing the V that is where the bridge of her nose begins. And I'm also starting to put this circle for the center of her nose, just so I could have a good idea for how it's gonna face. And then how wide it is, it's gonna be easier now because I can just use the size of her eyes to tell me how broad it's supposed to be. On her, the nostrils are about as broad as the space between her eyes, so that's how I've had it. And going to the lips, how I draw them is I try to draw out the line that's the opening for the lips before I start to draw in the actual shape of them, because I do think that the shape of the lips is secondary to how broad the actual mouth is. So yeah, I'm drawing out that line first before starting to fill it in with the shapes. And once we're zoomed out, we can get a better idea of the proportions. So I just need to draw in her ear right there before I am starting to draw her eye bags, which I think does a lot for the roundness of her eyes. And then I'm doing the same thing for the folds of her upper eyelid. I do think now I can see that I made the eyes a lot bigger than they should be. I will be readjusting them later on, but you guys might want to pay better attention than I did to their sizes, so you guys don't have to do that, but yeah. So when I draw irises, it's easier for me to figure out how to place them if I pay attention to how much of the whites of the eyes are visible. So for this one, as soon as I did that, I could see that I made her eyes more open than they should be. See, on hers are more half closed than how I drew them. And I did notice it while I was drawing, but I'm just leaving that off for now to draw in her eyebrows. And I'm just paying more attention to the shapes that they're making at this moment. Later on, I will be drawing the strands, but for now, I'm just trying to see how her features work with each other and if they're in proportion with each other. And then I am going in on her nose and trying to draw in the opening of her nostrils, and I think it does a lot to getting it to look like the shape of her actual nose, because before it kind of just looked like this big shape that's filling up her face. Now with the nostrils on, it looks like it's more tailored to her. So now that we have all of her features in, we're now going to start with a very light shading. So when you're doing this, you might want to use the pencil on its side so it's not as dark. And the first thing I'm doing is shading the shadow that's on her eye. And for the shading, she sort of has two light sources hitting her, and they're on the side, so the shadows on her are gonna be more toward the center of her face, and that's why you see the shadows are more toward the center of her nose. And I'm also just filling in her lips as one value. But then the shadow is once again centered on her chin, and we'll be going over her forehead too. When I'm doing this, I'm making sure that I'm leaving out the highlights, which are on the sides of her face. Just really getting the shadows just right at the center of her, and especially on her cheeks, which I really like how the shadows are falling on her cheek. And so I am just very lightly filling them in. You really want to go in with very light pressure on your paper, but then also use your pencil on its side so you don't get these very harsh lines when you're doing the shading. There's also some shadows that are cast by her hair, so we'll be going over those parts too. On her neck especially is where the shadows are the darkest, so I'm just filling that in before I go over the whole underside of her face to bring out the shape of her face more, but then also make it look like her neck and shoulders are more in shadow than her face. I'm also just very quickly drawing some of the details of her outfit. None of this is important to the actual portrait, but I do think that those shapes does a lot to the overall composition of the photo, and that's why I'm just gonna quickly fill them in. So once we have that, I'm now going over the initial values of her hair, and I'm very lightly trying to do them in the shapes that the waves of her hair are making, but really these initial shading is not that important. We're gonna go over them with darker tones later on, and there we'll be paying more attention to the shapes. For now, we're just looking at how the shading is gonna affect the overall shapes of the whole portrait, and we're gonna see if there are things we will need to adjust. For now, we are just looking at how the values on the hair is gonna affect the values on her face. And when I'm doing this, my pencil is still on its side. I don't want to put in very sharp lines this early on. I am using more force on her hair than on her face, but my pencil is still on its side, and so I am not adding in these very dark lines over them. So before we go on to the next step, I actually sharpened my pencil so I can get these very nice sharp lines. I'm starting with their eyes. I really just wanted to make it not as open as I initially had it, because I noticed that it wasn't reflecting what was in the reference photo. So focusing the dark lines on her upper lashes and also for the details of her actual irises. I also filled out her eye bags and her eyelids more before going in and drawing her actual eyebrows. I think I was paying more attention to how the eyebrows look this time, and also the shape that they're growing. So then we are moving on to her right eye, and we're doing the same thing as the left one, really just filling in the shadows and generally making it not as open as I had it before. I'm also trying to get in her lashes, which is something that I'm not great at, but I actually like how her lashes turned out this time. So yeah, we're just making sure that we're filling in the shadows of her eyes so that her eyeballs don't look like they're just plain white over the other shadings in her face. And then we are drawing in her right eyebrow the same way we did the left one. And then we're just darkening up the shadows that are on the center of her nose before very quickly just adjusting her nostrils, and then going back again to the shadows that are cast by her nose and making that darker too. I'm also, when I'm going over her lips, just darkening, once again darkening up her mouth line, but then when I'm shading her lips, I am starting from the darker side and then making sure that I'm leaving out space towards the center of her lips so that they look fuller, and then doing the same thing for the upper one. But after I've done her lips, I can already see that I still made her eyes a lot bigger than they should be. So right now you can see me erasing, especially towards the center, and then making sure that I don't draw her lashes too big so that it doesn't make her overall shape of her eyes look bigger. So now that we're done with her features, I am once again darkening up the shadows that are for her hair, and this time I am using more of the tip of my pencil so that my lines are darker and it stands out over top of the dark values that I've initially laid in for her hair. Also towards the side, I am making sure that I draw in some of the strands that are going out, but really what I'm making sure is that I'm getting the darker parts of her hair to be dark enough to stand out over the overall darker look of her hair. And as I'm going out from the darkest parts of those shadows, I am slowly lifting my pencil away from the paper so that it gradually gets lighter as it moves out from those darker shadows. And then when we are moving onto the left side, which is essentially darker, really going in with my pencil this time, and even though my pencil is still on its side, I'm adding a lot more pressure to the paper than I did before, so you can see it's a lot darker than how I initially had it. And also when I'm doing that, I make sure that I'm adding a lot of the shape to her natural hair because it's gonna be more apparent this time with my darker pencil lines. And I'm also doing the same thing to the top of her head, just adding more of the natural waves of her hair. I'm also making sure that I have the right shadows that are cast by her hair on her head. And then I'm going back to the other side of her hair and just making sure that the values on here keep up with the darker values that I put in for her left side. But then after that, I am just now adding a lot of the details to the rest of her. Like I'm making sure that the shadows also hitting her outfit, which is white, and I'm making sure that those values are right. But essentially we're almost done with the drawing. When you're looking at it side by side, the photos don't at all look like each other. But also that wasn't the goal for this one. What I really wanted to capture was her essence. So I wanted it to look like it's her when you're looking at the sketch, but I don't necessarily want it to look exactly like the reference photo. But yeah, as the final touches, I am once again taking my Copic Opaque White to add in these very tiny highlights. This isn't necessary, and I could have just done this with my eraser and I would have gotten a better result, but this is what I did, and so that is it for this whole sketch. Once again, if you like my real-time walkthroughs, I do them on my Patreon, and thank you to my existing patrons for supporting me, and I will be seeing you guys again soon.